My wife nearly got shot over grass height. Not politics, not crime, just grass. Welcome to Meadowbrook, where the HOA president thinks she's Judge Judy with a tape measure. We came here to raise cattle, fix fences, and enjoy the quiet. Instead, we got threats, fines, and a clipboard warrior named Candace who treats lawn care like Homeland Security. What started as a silly citation turned into the kind of standoff you wouldn't believe if I hadn't lived it. Let's just say, you never truly know who your spouse is until a cop shows up in your barn. Ever dealt with HOA madness? Drop your story below. I'm betting it gets weird. After 2 tours in Iraq, I'd earned the right to live out my remaining years in peace on land I'd built with my own hands. Meadowbrook Ranch in Alabama wasn't just 20 acres with a handful of cattle. It was my slice of freedom, bought and paid for with blood, sweat, and military pension. Kelly had embraced the dream too, converting our barn into a small fitness studio where she helped local women stay strong. We weren't bothering anyone, weren't asking for anything except the simple right to exist on our own property. Life was exactly what I'd fought for overseas: quiet, predictable, and free from people trying to control every aspect of our existence. That peaceful existence lasted exactly 4 months, until we walked into the Piggly Wiggly and met our first real neighbor. I spotted her before Kelly did, a woman in a pristine white blazer standing by the produce section, but her attention wasn't on vegetables. She was studying my wife with focused intensity that made my combat instinct start humming. "Excuse me," she said with that particular southern sweetness that usually precedes a knife in the back. "Are you folks the new people out at the old Henderson place?" Kelly straightened up with her polite stranger smile. "Yes, ma'am, that's us. I'm Kelly Hayes and this is my husband, Brad." The woman's eyes narrowed as she studied Kelly's face like she was reading microprint. "Well, I'm Candace Monroe, president of the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. I do hope y'all are planning to maintain the property standards we've worked so hard to establish here." Something in the way she said property standards set my teeth on edge. But Kelly just nodded pleasantly. "Of course, we're just simple folks looking to live quietly with our cattle." That word, cattle, hit Candace like a personal insult. I watched Kelly's shoulders tense slightly as she caught the flash of disgust in Candace's expression, but my wife's face remained perfectly calm. She'd learned long ago not to react to provocation, a skill that would prove more valuable than either of us realized. "Cattle?" Candace repeated, pulling out her phone to make an actual note right there in front of us. "How rustic." The way she pronounced rustic made it sound like a communicable disease. She looked back up with that fake smile stretched tight across her face. "Well, I'm sure we'll be seeing each other very soon. The HOA takes community standards very seriously here at Meadowbrook." As she clicked away on her heels, Kelly turned to me with confusion written across her features. "Did that feel personal to you?" she asked quietly. I nodded, watching Candace's reflection in the store window as she lingered by the exit, still observing us like a predator studying potential prey. 3 days later, Candace appeared at our gate, dressed like she was about to foreclose on Fort Knox. The white blazer had been upgraded to a full power suit, complete with dark sunglasses and a clipboard that could have stopped small arms fire. Standing there, with our peaceful cattle grazing behind her, she looked like a corporate attorney who'd taken a wrong turn into rural America. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes," she announced without preamble, "I'm here to conduct the mandatory new resident compliance inspection." Neither of us remembered agreeing to any inspection, but Candace was already marching around our property like she owned every blade of grass. For the next hour, she measured grass with a ruler and counted our cattle like each was a personal insult to her vision of suburban perfection. When she finished, she presented us with a 3-page manifesto of violations that read like a declaration of war against common sense. "Livestock visible from the road. Grass, 1/2 inch too high," she announced, her voice dripping with moral authority. Each item sounded more ridiculous than the last. But Candace delivered them with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice reading capital charges. Kelly stepped forward, and I noticed her posture shift into something more alert, more focused. "Ma'am, we reviewed the HOA bylaws before purchasing. There's nothing about livestock restrictions for properties over 10 acres. Candace's smile could have frozen hell. "The rules are evolving, dear. Community standards must be maintained. You have 30 days to address these issues or we'll be forced to take further action." As she walked back to her spotless white SUV, Kelly remained motionless, tracking every step with the kind of professional attention I'd seen soldiers use when watching enemy movements. "Brad," she said quietly, "that woman wasn't conducting an inspection. She was building a case. I studied my wife's expression, seeing something I didn't recognize, not fear or anger, but the kind of careful assessment that suggested Kelly was already 3 moves ahead in a game I didn't understand yet. When Candace drove away that afternoon, she thought she'd delivered an ultimatum to helpless ranch folks. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone who'd spent years teaching people how to survive much more dangerous conflicts than HOA politics. That night, as Kelly paced around our kitchen reading through HOA documents with the intensity of a lawyer preparing for trial, I couldn't shake the feeling that our quiet country life was about to get very complicated indeed. The next morning, I discovered what suburban psychological warfare looks like when conducted by someone with too much time and too little sense. Candace had apparently decided our property needed constant supervision because she started appearing everywhere with the persistence of a government audit and twice the hostility. She was at the mailbox every morning as Kelly jogged past, always watching. Then came the encounters at every public place in town, each one featuring Candace with her clipboard and camera, documenting our existence like we were subjects in some twisted behavioral study. But here's what really caught my attention. She wasn't watching both of us equally. Every surveillance session focused laser-like on Kelly, tracking my wife's movements with the dedication of a private investigator working a cheating spouse case. When Kelly hung laundry or tended our small vegetable garden, there was Candace, across the street with actual binoculars, studying my wife's every gesture like she was trying to solve some personal mystery. "Honey," I said one afternoon as we watched Candace attempt to photograph our cattle while hiding behind a stop sign, "I'm starting to think this goes way beyond normal HOA crazy." Kelly lowered the kitchen curtain she'd been peeking through and turned to me with that increasingly familiar expression of careful analysis. "She's not collecting evidence for property violations, Brad. She's studying me specifically, how I move, where I go, what my routine looks like. That's not homeowner association behavior. That's something much more personal." The way Kelly said it, with that hint of professional recognition in her voice, made me wonder, not for the first time, what exactly my wife had done before we met. There was something in her tone that suggested she'd encountered this kind of targeted surveillance before and knew how to respond to it. Kelly's counterattack was a masterpiece of polite precision. Instead of confronting Candace directly or escalating the situation, my wife did something beautifully calculated. She wrote a formal letter correcting every spelling and grammar mistake in Candace's violation notices. Kelly had been taught that discipline begins with every word and sentence, and her response reflected that military attention to detail. The letter was 2 pages of surgical politeness, pointing out errors like misusing your, and that was one of the kinder corrections. "Dear Mrs. Monroe," the letter began, "thank you for your recent correspondence regarding property compliance. I've taken the liberty of correcting several errors to ensure clarity in future communication." What followed was a systematic dissection of Candace's incompetence, delivered with the kind of professional courtesy that made every correction feel like a gentle slap across the face. Kelly cited proper HOA documentation standards, included examples of correct legal formatting, and suggested that future correspondence might benefit from basic proofreading. It was less a response and more a masterclass in how to professionally humiliate someone while maintaining perfect politeness. The effect on Candace was immediate and spectacular. Within 24 hours, she'd escalated to filing complaints with every city department that would listen, apparently spending her entire night researching angles of attack that might stick. But instead of being stressed by this escalation, Kelly seemed almost energized by it. While I was ready to lose my mind dealing with inspector after inspector showing up unannounced, my wife was maintaining detailed files that would have impressed a Pentagon records officer. She photographed every interaction, recorded exact times and dates, and maintained documentation that captured not just what happened, but how each official responded to our cooperation. "Kelly," I said one evening, watching her organize yet another folder of evidence, "how do you know so much about proper documentation procedures? This isn't normal civilian knowledge." She looked up from her paperwork with an expression that suggested there were layers to her background I'd never explored. "You pick up certain skills in structured environments, Brad. Sometimes experience teaches you to be prepared for conflicts you hope never happen." That night, I found myself studying my wife as she worked, noticing details I'd somehow missed before. The way she organized information wasn't random. It followed patterns that suggested formal training in evidence collection and case building. Her handwriting was precise in a way that spoke of military discipline, and her approach to the mounting harassment campaign was systematic rather than emotional. When I called my buddy Mike to vent about our HOA situation, he asked a question that stopped me cold. "Brad, what exactly did Kelly do before you two got together?" I realized with uncomfortable clarity that I'd never gotten a complete answer to that question, and maybe it was time I did. The next morning brought our first major confrontation when I heard raised voices from our front yard. Walking around the house, I found Kelly standing calmly by our mailbox while Candace gestured wildly with her clipboard, her voice carrying across the property like an air raid siren. "You think you're so smart with your little grammar lessons," Candace was saying, her professional facade finally cracking into genuine rage. "But I know exactly what kind of person you are under that innocent act." Kelly's response was delivered in a tone so controlled it seemed almost gentle. "Ma'am, I believe you have me confused with someone else. But if you'd like to discuss actual property issues, I'm happy to review the HOA bylaws with you." The contrast between Candace's hysteria and Kelly's professional calm only seemed to inflame the situation further, and I watched my wife handle verbal aggression with the kind of competence that suggested this wasn't her first hostile encounter. As Candace stormed back to her SUV, Kelly remained perfectly still, watching her leave with focused attention that made me realize my wife was gathering intelligence rather than just observing a neighbor's tantrum. The breakthrough came through small-town gossip and old newspaper archives, delivered by two women at the feed store who had no idea they were solving a mystery that had been eating at me for weeks. "That Monroe woman is obsessed," one of them said as I pretended to study chicken feed prices. "She's got newspaper clippings and everything, trying to prove that military girl is dangerous." The mention of newspaper clippings made my blood run cold, because it suggested Candace's campaign against Kelly was based on something specific rather than general HOA insanity. "My cousin works at City Hall," the second woman continued, "and she said Candace has been there every day, going through old records about some training accident from 5 years ago." A training accident. Those words hit me like physical blows as pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known existed started snapping into place. When I got home, I found Kelly at the kitchen table surrounded by her usual documentation, but today was different. Today she was staring at an old newspaper article with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear exactly, but recognition mixed with something that looked like the weight of old decisions coming back to haunt her. "Kelly," I said, setting down the feed bags with hands that weren't quite steady. "You okay?" She looked up at me with eyes that held answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask. "Brad, I think I know why Candace hates me. I need to show you something that happened 5 years ago." She turned the newspaper around so I could read the headline that would explain everything. "Local woman injured in military training exercise." The article was brief, just a few paragraphs about a young woman named Rachel Monroe who'd been hurt during a Navy training program. The injury had ended her military career before it really started, and at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a quote that made everything clear. Instructor K. Hayes declined to comment on the specific incident. I looked from the newspaper to my wife's face and back again, understanding flooding through me like cold water. "Hayes? Kelly Hayes? This was you?" She nodded slowly, her voice carrying the weight of a decision that had haunted her for years. "Rachel Monroe. I remember her now. I understand why my wife never spoke of old campaigns. A good soldier rarely brags about victories that came at such personal cost." Kelly's explanation was direct and unflinching. "Rachel broke safety rules in a night water drill, nearly got someone killed. I failed her. It cost her career, but it saved lives." The way she said it, without self-pity or justification, told me everything about the kind of person my wife really was. She'd made an impossible choice between one woman's dreams and other people's lives, and she'd chosen to protect the many at the cost of becoming someone's permanent enemy. "Her sister Candace never forgave me for ending Rachel's military dream," Kelly continued, her fingers tracing the edge of the newspaper article. "The weight of that choice, protecting future soldiers by crushing one family's hopes, was written across my wife's face like a scar that had never fully healed." What struck me most was how Kelly had handled that impossible situation alone, making a decision that saved lives while destroying dreams, then bearing the professional and personal consequences without complaint. The newspaper article mentioned the controversy, the family's anger, the review that ultimately vindicated Kelly's judgment, but it couldn't capture the personal cost of being right when being right meant making lifelong enemies. Suddenly, everything clicked into place with terrifying clarity as I realized we weren't dealing with random HOA harassment, but calculated revenge 5 years in the making. So when Candace moved here and recognized you, I began, and Kelly finished the thought. She saw the woman who destroyed her sister's military career, and she's been planning payback ever since. I thought about all the times Kelly had seemed to carry some invisible burden, and realized she'd been living with the knowledge that doing the right thing had made her enemies who would never forgive her for choosing safety over sympathy. The professional decision that had probably saved multiple lives had created a personal vendetta that was now threatening the peaceful life we'd built together. Before I could ask more questions about that time in Kelly's life, we heard the familiar sound of gravel crunching in our driveway. Through the window, we could see Candace's white SUV approaching, but this time she wasn't alone. 2 other official-looking vehicles followed behind her, and my stomach dropped as I recognized the systematic escalation of someone who'd finally connected all the dots in her own personal vendetta. Kelly stood and moved to the window with movements that were becoming more purposeful and controlled with each confrontation. "She knows," Kelly said simply. "The question now is how far she's willing to push this." As we watched Candace approach our door with what appeared to be a small army of officials, I realized that my wife's past had finally caught up with us, and the woman who'd spent years teaching people to survive impossible situations was about to face the consequences of a decision that had been right, necessary, and utterly unforgivable to the family it had affected. The peaceful retirement I'd earned through military service was about to become another kind of battlefield entirely. The inspection that followed was bureaucratic warfare conducted with the precision of a military campaign and the spite of a personal vendetta. For 3 hours, Candace's team of officials crawled over our property like they were investigating a federal crime scene, finding violations that seemed to materialize from thin air with each measurement they took. Our barn blocked visibility and cows congregated too close to the fence. Yes, apparently, cows loiter now. Each citation was more ridiculous than the last, but delivered with the solemnity of federal agents documenting national security threats. Throughout this bureaucratic circus, Kelly maintained the kind of professional composure that should have been reassuring to any reasonable official. She answered every question with precision, requested copies of all measurements, and politely pointed out procedural errors when the inspectors made mistakes in their documentation. But instead of being impressed by her cooperation, I noticed the officials seemed increasingly uncomfortable with Kelly's competence. She knew too much about proper citation procedures, asked too many pointed questions about jurisdiction and authority, and demonstrated familiarity with government operations that went far beyond what they expected from a ranch wife. By the time they finished, Candace's satisfaction was obvious, but so was her frustration that Kelly hadn't provided the emotional breakdown she'd clearly been hoping to witness. "This isn't over," Candace announced as her team prepared to leave, her voice carrying the kind of vindictive pleasure that comes from believing you've just destroyed someone's life. "These violations will be reported to every relevant authority. You have 15 days to address them all or face significant fines and possible legal action." Kelly's response was delivered with the same calm professionalism she'd maintained throughout the entire inspection. "We understand completely, Mrs. Monroe. We'll review everything with our attorney and respond through appropriate channels." The mention of legal representation made Candace's eye twitch slightly, but she maintained her smile as she walked back to her official convoy, clearly believing she'd just won a decisive victory in her personal war against my wife. That evening, as Kelly organized the day's documentation with her usual methodical precision, I finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been bothering me since the morning's events. "Kelly, what exactly did you do in the Navy? And don't say training. I need the whole truth." She looked up from her files, and for a moment I saw something vulnerable in her expression, like she was deciding whether to trust me with information she'd kept private for years. "I was a Navy SEAL instructor, Brad. Specifically, I trained people for high-risk operations where failure meant death. Water survival, combat swimming, tactical response. If someone needed to learn how to stay alive in impossible situations, they came to me." The casual way she said it hit me like a physical blow, recontextualizing everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd married. "You trained Navy SEALs," I repeated, trying to process what I was hearing. "Honey, why didn't you tell me?" Kelly's laugh was rueful, tinged with years of having to explain herself to people who couldn't understand the weight of her former responsibilities. Because most people hear Navy SEAL and think either I'm exaggerating or that I must be some kind of warrior woman. The truth is more complicated. I was an instructor, not a combatant. But yes, I trained some of the most elite soldiers in the world to survive impossible situations. Suddenly, everything about my wife's behavior over the past few weeks made perfect sense. The calm under pressure, the systematic documentation, the way she seemed to analyze every situation like a tactical problem with solutions that required careful planning and flawless execution. "So when you failed Rachel Monroe," I began, and Kelly finished the thought with the kind of matter-of-fact delivery that comes from having relived a difficult decision countless times. "I made a choice that probably saved her life and the lives of future trainees. She broke fundamental safety protocols during a night water exercise, and in real combat situations, that kind of recklessness gets people killed." Kelly pulled out her phone and showed me a photo I'd never seen before, a group shot of military personnel in training gear, including a younger Kelly in instructor uniform, standing next to a young woman who looked exactly like a 20-something version of Candace. "That's Rachel," she said, pointing to the young woman whose face held the same determined intensity I'd learned to recognize in her sister. Help was taken 2 days before the incident that ended her military career, and made me a permanent enemy of the Monroe family. Before I could fully process the implications of everything Kelly had just revealed, our house phone rang with the harsh electronic tone that always seemed to signal trouble. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but Kelly answered with her usual polite greeting that masked the professional alertness I was only now beginning to understand. "Hayes residence." I watched her face change as she listened to whoever was on the other end, her expression shifting from courtesy to sharp attention. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that?" she said, her voice taking on an edge that suggested the conversation had moved into dangerous territory. "You're saying there's been a complaint about what exactly?" I moved closer so I could hear fragments of the conversation, catching official-sounding language about domestic disturbance and welfare check that made my stomach drop with the realization that Candace had just escalated our conflict to an entirely new level. Kelly was quiet for a long moment, processing information that was clearly more serious than routine bureaucratic harassment. Then she said, "Officer, I can assure you that there's no emergency here. My husband and I are home alone, and there's been no disturbance of any kind." But apparently the caller wasn't satisfied with that assurance, because Kelly's next words confirmed my worst fears about where this situation was heading. "Yes, sir, we'll be here, but I want to be clear that this is a false report." She hung up and turned to me with an expression that combined anger with something else, something that looked almost like anticipation, as if she'd been expecting this escalation and was prepared for it. "Let me guess," I said, feeling the familiar knot of combat stress forming in my gut. "Candace called the police?" Kelly nodded, but there was something in her demeanor that suggested this wasn't the disaster I thought it was. An anonymous tip about domestic violence. They're sending someone to do a welfare check. Brad, this is exactly what I expected her to do next. When bureaucratic harassment doesn't work, people like Candace escalate to law enforcement. The question is, how far is she willing to push this? As we heard the sound of a patrol car pulling into our driveway, I realized that our quiet ranch life was about to become the backdrop for a confrontation that would test everything Kelly had learned in her years of training people to survive in situations where the wrong move could get someone killed. Officer Rick Daniels looked exactly like Central Casting would order for small-town cop. Mid-40s, slightly overweight, with the kind of mustache that suggested he took his authority very seriously. But there was something in his eyes when Kelly opened the door that made my Marine instincts start screaming warnings. He wasn't approaching this as a routine welfare check. His hand was resting on his weapon, his stance was defensive, and he was looking at my wife like she was a potential threat rather than a possible victim. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the kind of formal tension that cops use when they're expecting trouble. "I'm Officer Daniels with the County Sheriff's Department. We received a report of a domestic disturbance at this address." Kelly's response was immediate and perfect. Concerned but cooperative, worried but not defensive. "Officer, I'm not sure what you mean by domestic disturbance. My husband and I have been home all evening, and we haven't had any arguments or problems." But Daniels wasn't buying it. He kept scanning our property like he was looking for evidence of something specific, and I noticed his gaze lingering on our barn, where Kelly kept her fitness equipment. Ma'am, the caller indicated there might be safety concerns regarding weapons or training materials on the property. That's when I knew Candace had fed him a very specific story, because Daniels was clearly expecting to find something military that would justify his obvious suspicion. Kelly didn't miss a beat, her response calibrated to be helpful without being defensive. Officer, my husband is a military veteran and I do some personal training work. We have standard fitness equipment, all of it legal and properly stored. Would you like to see our permits? The way she offered documentation, calmly, without defensiveness, should have reassured any reasonable cop. But Daniels seemed more agitated by her cooperation rather than less. As we walked toward the barn, Kelly maintained a steady commentary that demonstrated knowledge of law enforcement procedures that surprised me and clearly unsettled Daniels. Of course, officer. I should mention that we have security cameras recording this interaction for insurance purposes, and I'll be happy to provide you with contact information for our attorney if needed. Most civilians would have stumbled through that kind of situation with nervous energy and confused questions, but Kelly was handling it like she'd been through police interactions before. Lots of them. When Daniel saw what was inside our converted barn, his demeanor shifted from suspicious to actively hostile, and I realized that Candace's description had primed him to see threats where none existed. Standard gym gear, a few old manuals, nothing threatening, unless you understood what it all really meant. But Daniels was processing the setup through the lens of whatever story Candace had fed him, seeing military-style training where Kelly saw workout equipment and professional reference materials. Ma'am, this looks like tactical training equipment. Are you conducting any kind of military or combat training on this property? Kelly's answer was technically accurate, but carefully incomplete. I provide personal fitness training, sir. Everything you see here is standard equipment available at any sporting goods store. But I could see Daniels interpreting her calm competence as evidence of deception rather than cooperation, his paranoia feeding on itself until he'd convinced himself that my wife was hiding something dangerous. That's when everything went catastrophically wrong. Daniel spotted Kelly's collection of training manuals on a shelf, books about water survival, tactical fitness, and emergency response that she'd accumulated during her Navy career, and something in his mind snapped. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back from the equipment and keep your hands visible. His voice had taken on the hard edge that cops use when they've decided someone is dangerous, and I felt my own training kicking in as I recognized the signs of a situation about to spiral completely out of control. Kelly immediately complied, raising her hands slightly and taking a step back, but her movement was too smooth, too professional. Instead of looking like a scared civilian, she looked like someone who'd been trained to respond to armed authority without panic or confusion. Officer, she said, her voice still calm but somehow more authoritative than before. My hands are visible, and I'm complying with your instructions. Can you please explain what specific safety concern you're addressing? The question was perfectly reasonable, delivered in a tone that suggested genuine desire to cooperate, but it seemed to push Daniels over some invisible line. Maybe it was Kelly's unnatural calm, maybe it was the way she was clearly more comfortable with the situation than he was, or maybe Candace had painted an even darker picture than I'd realized. Ma'am, I need you to put your hands behind your head and step away from all equipment now. When Kelly complied without question, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from years of following orders under pressure, Daniels made his fatal mistake. He drew his weapon. Keep your hands where I can see them, he shouted, his gun pointed directly at my wife's head. In that moment, everything changed. Not just the situation, which had gone from routine check to potential tragedy in seconds, but Kelly herself. The woman standing in our barn with a firearm aimed at her skull wasn't the fitness instructor and ranch wife I'd married. This was someone else entirely. Someone who looked at an armed police officer the way a professional might evaluate a technical problem that required careful solution rather than emotional reaction. Officer, Kelly said, her voice absolutely steady despite having a weapon pointed at her head. My hands are visible and I'm not moving toward any equipment. You're currently in violation of standard de-escalation procedures, and I need you to identify the specific threat you're responding to. The way she said it, not pleading or scared, but professionally critical of his technique, should have been reassuring evidence that she wasn't a threat. Instead, it seemed to terrify Daniels even more, because here was a woman who knew police procedure better than he did, who was analyzing his performance while he had her at gunpoint. I started to move toward them, but Kelly shot me a look that stopped me cold. It was a look that said, I've got this handled, in a way that suggested she'd been in situations like this before, and knew exactly how to manage an armed confrontation without getting anyone killed. Brad, she said without taking her eyes off Daniels, please stay where you are and don't make any sudden movements. Officer Daniels is going to realize very shortly that he's made a procedural error, and we want to help him correct it safely." The confidence in her voice was absolute, and I suddenly understood why Kelly had seemed so unfazed by all of Candace's harassment. This wasn't her first time dealing with hostile situations, and it probably wasn't even close to the most dangerous thing she'd faced. As I watched my wife calmly manage a situation that should have been terrifying, I realized that Candace Monroe had just made a mistake that would change everything. She'd forced Kelly to reveal skills and experience that my wife had been content to keep hidden. And judging by the way Kelly was handling Officer Daniels, professionally, competently, and without a trace of fear, Candace had picked a fight with someone who was trained to win conflicts a lot more serious than HOA disputes. The aftermath of the gun incident was like watching a masterclass in crisis management. While Officer Daniels stood there, shaking and obviously realizing he'd screwed up in ways that could end his career, Kelly shifted into full professional mode. She methodically documented everything: badge number, patrol car number, time of incident, exact sequence of events. She was polite but absolutely thorough, and it became clear that this wasn't her first time filing a complaint against law enforcement. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice maintaining that eerily calm tone, "I understand that you were responding to a call, but drawing your weapon on an unarmed, compliant civilian requires specific justification under department policy. I'll need to know what imminent threat you perceived that warranted deadly force." Daniel stammered something about suspicious equipment and potential weapons, but Kelly's questions exposed the weakness of his position with surgical precision. What really impressed me was how Kelly managed the situation without escalating it further. She could have been angry, could have threatened legal action, could have made Daniels feel like the idiot he'd just proven himself to be. Instead, she treated it like a training exercise, walking him through proper de-escalation procedures and helping him understand where his response had gone wrong. "Officer, when conducting welfare checks, department policy typically requires you to identify specific threats before drawing your weapon. Fitness equipment and training manuals don't constitute imminent danger under standard protocols." By the time Daniels left our property, he looked like a man who knew he'd just dodged a career-ending bullet, and Kelly had obtained a formal incident report that documented every detail of his misconduct. As his patrol car disappeared down our road, I turned to my wife with newfound respect and a dozen questions. "Kelly, where did you learn to handle cops like that?" She was quiet for a moment, organizing her documentation with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else in this conflict. "Brad, I need to tell you something about my Navy service that I've never mentioned." She looked up at me with an expression that was part apology and part relief. "I wasn't just a fitness instructor who happened to work with military personnel. I was a Navy SEAL tactical trainer. For 8 years, I prepared special operations teams for missions where everything had to go perfectly or people died." The words hit me like a physical blow. Navy SEAL tactical trainer. That explained everything: the calm under pressure, the systematic approach to conflict, the way she seemed to analyze every situation like a military operation. "You trained Navy SEALs?" I repeated, trying to process what I was hearing. "Honey, why didn't you tell me?" Kelly's laugh was rueful. "Because most people hear Navy SEAL and think either I'm exaggerating or that I must be some kind of warrior woman. The truth is more complicated. I was an instructor, not a combatant. But yes, I trained some of the most elite soldiers in the world to survive impossible situations." "Including Rachel Monroe," I said, and Kelly nodded. "Rachel was in one of my advanced water survival courses. She was talented but reckless, and during a night exercise, she broke safety protocols that could have killed her training partner. When someone proves they can't follow life or death rules, they don't get to continue in special operations training." Kelly pulled out her phone and showed me a photo I'd never seen before. A group shot of military personnel in training gear, including a younger Kelly in instructor uniform and a young woman who looked exactly like a 20-something version of Candace. "That's Rachel," she said, pointing to the young woman, and that was taken 2 days before the incident that ended her military career. Looking at the photo, I could see both the family resemblance and the determined expression that Rachel shared with her sister. "So when Candace recognized you?" "She saw the woman who destroyed her sister's dreams," Kelly finished, "and she's been planning revenge ever since." Kelly put her phone away and turned to face me fully. "Brad, there's something else you need to know. My call sign during those years was Ghost. Not because I was sneaky, but because I had a reputation for making problems disappear quietly, efficiently, The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, not because I was afraid of my wife, but because I suddenly understood that Candace Monroe had picked a fight with someone who was professionally trained to win conflicts. "So what happens now?" I asked. Kelly's smile was small, but absolutely confident. "Now, Candace has escalated this from harassment to involving law enforcement under false pretenses. She's also caused a police officer to commit misconduct that could end his career. That changes the rules of engagement completely." Over the next 3 days, I watched Kelly transform our dining room into something that looked like a military command center. She had maps of our neighborhood, timelines of Candace's harassment, copies of every document and photograph from the past 2 months, and what appeared to be detailed psychological profiles of everyone involved in the situation. "Kelly," I said, studying the wall of evidence she'd assembled, "this looks like you're planning an invasion." She looked up from her laptop, where she was typing something that looked like an official report. "Not an invasion, honey. A systematic resolution of the conflict using appropriate tactical responses." She gestured to her evidence wall. "Candace has been conducting a harassment campaign using bureaucratic weapons, city inspections, false police reports. She's escalated to involving law enforcement under false pretenses, which is a felony in this state. Now I respond using appropriate force." "Appropriate force?" I asked, and Kelly's smile became predatory. "Documentation, legal action, and public exposure of her harassment pattern. Candace thinks she's been fighting a helpless ranch wife. Time for her to meet the ghost." She turned her laptop screen toward me, showing what appeared to be a comprehensive report detailing every interaction we'd had with Candace, complete with photos, witness statements, and legal analysis. "This goes to the county sheriff's department, the state attorney's office, and the HOA board simultaneously. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know exactly what Candace Monroe has been doing and why." As I read through Kelly's report, I realized that my wife had been preparing for this moment since our first encounter with Candace. Every document, every photograph, every carefully recorded interaction had been building toward this comprehensive case that would be impossible for anyone to ignore or dismiss. Candace had spent months trying to build a case against us, but Kelly had been building a better case against Candace the entire time. And judging by the evidence assembled on our dining room wall, our HOA president was about to discover that she'd been outgunned from the very beginning. The next morning brought the kind of poetic justice that you usually only see in movies. Kelly's comprehensive report hit every relevant authority simultaneously: sheriff's department, state attorney, HOA board, and city council, like a coordinated military strike. Within 2 hours, our phone was ringing with calls from officials who suddenly wanted to hear our side of the story. The timing was perfect, because that same morning, Candace made her final desperate play. She filed for an emergency restraining order against both Kelly and me, claiming we'd been stalking and threatening her. The irony was beautiful. Here was a woman who'd spent months conducting surveillance on our property, filing false reports and manipulating law enforcement, now claiming that we were the ones engaging in harassment. The hearing was scheduled for 2 p.m. that same day, which gave Kelly exactly 4 hours to prepare her presentation. I offered to help, but she just smiled and said, "Honey, I've been preparing for this moment since the day Candace showed up at our gate." She spent the morning organizing her evidence into what looked like a professional briefing package, complete with photographs, timeline charts, and legal documentation that would have impressed a Pentagon analyst. When I asked where she'd learned to prepare legal presentations like this, Kelly's answer was characteristically matter-of-fact. "When you're responsible for training people for life-or-death missions, you learn to document everything. In special operations, if you can't prove what happened, people die." The courtroom scene was everything I could have hoped for in terms of dramatic justice. Candace arrived with fabricated evidence and confidence that suggested she thought she'd already won. She was dressed like she was attending a country club board meeting, complete with pearls and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When the judge called Kelly's name and my wife stood to present her case, the transformation was immediate and complete. This wasn't the ranch wife who made me coffee every morning. This was Ghost, the tactical trainer who'd spent years making presentations where lives hung in the balance. Kelly's presentation was a masterpiece of systematic destruction. She began with a timeline showing Candace's harassment campaign from day one, supported by photographs and documents that proved premeditation and escalation. She presented the police body camera footage that clearly showed Officer Daniels drawing his weapon without justification. She included testimony from Candace's previous targets, families who'd been driven from the neighborhood by similar harassment campaigns. But the moment that sealed Candace's fate came when Kelly played the audio recording she'd made of Candace's phone call. "I found her," Candace's voice said clearly through the courtroom speakers. "The woman who destroyed Rachel's career. Now it's time for me to destroy her life." The judge's expression shifted from professional interest to active disgust as the recording continued, revealing Candace's admission that the entire harassment campaign had been motivated by personal revenge rather than legitimate HOA concerns. When the recording ended, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of Candace's sharp intake of breath as she realized her own words had just destroyed any credibility she might have had. Kelly's final statement was delivered with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of making critical decisions under pressure. "Your Honor, Mrs. Monroe has engaged in a systematic harassment campaign motivated by personal vendetta, culminating in filing false police reports that resulted in a firearm being drawn on an unarmed civilian. This isn't an HOA dispute. It's stalking, harassment, and abuse of legal process." The judge's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Not only was Candace's restraining order request denied, but a restraining order was issued against her, barring her from approaching our property or contacting us in any way. Officer Daniels was suspended pending investigation. Candace was removed from her HOA position and banned from community leadership. Most satisfying of all, the judge ordered Candace to pay our legal costs and impose significant fines for filing false reports. The aftermath was everything we could have hoped for. The HOA board apologized publicly and invited Kelly to serve as interim president. Kelly's first official act was revising community rules, eliminating arbitrary restrictions used as weapons against residents. Within a month, Candace and her husband quietly moved away, unable to face the community that now knew exactly what kind of person she really was. Officer Daniels was permanently reassigned to desk duty after departmental review confirmed he'd violated multiple protocols. The local newspaper ran a story about HOA abuse, using our case as an example of how residents could fight back against harassment. 6 months later, as I watch Kelly lead a self-defense class for women in our community, I can't help but smile at how perfectly everything worked out. Candace had spent months trying to destroy what she saw as a quiet ranch wife who'd wronged her family, but she'd actually been targeting Ghost, a professional who'd spent years training people to survive situations far more dangerous than suburban HOA politics. Kelly is finally able to be completely herself, using her skills to help our community instead of hiding them. She started a veterans support group, teaches tactical fitness classes, and has become the kind of leader people actually want to follow rather than fear. Our ranch has become a gathering place for the neighborhood, with barbecues and training sessions that bring people together instead of driving them apart. When people ask me about our HOA troubles, I always end the story the same way. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's becoming exactly who you're meant to be. And sometimes justice just needs a little help from someone who knows how to fight the right way. Candace Monroe thought she was hunting a helpless victim, but she'd actually cornered a professional warrior who was just trying to live quietly. The moral of the story is simple: be very careful who you pick a fight with, because you never know when that quiet neighbor might turn out to be someone who's trained to win conflicts that matter a lot more than HOA violations.
QA Stories thanks you for hanging out today. Don't forget to binge a few more. Trust us, you'll be hooked.